But I plan to finish up the commandment that we've been looking at about honoring your father and mother. So we went through last week and we took a look at this layout of the love the Lord your God and love your neighbor concepts within the book, the Ten Commandments. And I told you that what actually happened in the Ten Commandments is that according to Jewish tradition and what the archaeological evidence would suggest is that the Ten Commandments were written on 2 tablets, not because half of them were on one tablet and half on the other, because there were 2 identical copies of the tablets that had 5 commands on one side and 5 commands on the other. And so if you look at the numbers here, there are only 4 love the Lord your God, or at least obviously love the Lord your God, and there are 6 love your neighbor. But the way that it was set up is that honor your father and mother was put over on the side of love the Lord your God. And we've gone through and talked about why that might be in terms of it being about the idea of authority and honoring authority, and that the authority of your father in particular, but also of your mother, flows from God and flows back into God. And what children see and how they learn to honor their fathers and mothers is going to have a significant impact on how they honor God's authority and how they honor authority more generally. And so we also talked in the previous several weeks about the notion of Christians and authority in the general sense, and how we interact with the government, and how we interact with the church leadership, and how we interact with other human beings who don't necessarily have a greater position than us, but who the Scripture tells us that we should honor ahead of ourselves. So when we look at all these different aspects of Christian life and honoring authority, that's where I think this notion of honoring your father and mother belongs equally well, if not better, under the idea of loving the Lord your God. And certainly the Jewish scholars who have studied this, and the historians and the mythology, what's the word I'm looking for here? Not history, but tradition suggests that it was set up this way, on the Ten Commandments themselves. So later on in this lesson, in this series, when we get to the end, I'm going to go through and talk about, there's actually, not only is there differences in terms of laying out this way, but there's also differences in terms of the way that the Jewish scholars consider what they consider commandments. So, and how they, in some cases, combine them together in ways that we don't always do it. We put them as these 10. In the Jewish tradition, there are some other ways that is organized. We'll talk more about that in a few weeks. But today what I wanted to talk about is the passage in Romans that I've been not hinting at, but mentioning off and on as we've been going through this discussion, that talks about, and is probably the strongest word we encounter in the Scriptures about secular authority and how Christians interact with secular authority. And we see that over in Romans chapter 13. So Paul here says every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. It is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience's sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And that last one, render to all what is due them, is pretty much taken directly from one of Jesus' teachings when he was asked about paying taxes. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. So we have this very, it's a very clear articulation of the idea of how Christians are supposed to interact with civil authorities, with secular authorities. So what I want to do is take a look at this a little bit in the context, first of all, of what he's saying about the nature of authority, and in particular about some of the assumptions that Paul makes in here about authority and what its purposes are and how it's going to be used. And again, we have to remember that this is in the context of Paul. When he's writing this, by this time Paul has at some point probably been imprisoned by the Romans, actually on more than one occasion by the Romans, if nothing else on his missionary journeys. He has definitely been under attack by Jewish authorities and by the leaders secular, so to speak, leaders of Israel at the time. And yet he says that rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior. Setting aside the specifics of Paul's problem, would we agree that that is generally true in most, at least most Western governments, that you have a great deal more to fear from the government if you are doing evil things and if you are doing good things?
Oh, yeah.
I think so. You know, now we can argue about, that our government allows and authorizes things that we don't think are right, and that there are behaviors that perhaps we would like to see either criminalized or at least to see them disappear from society that our government makes no effort to stop. But in general, when we think about people who are really what we would call evildoers, people who are looking to do bad things, in general, they are the ones that are have the most to fear from the secular authorities, at least in the kinds of democracies and societies that we have experience with for the most part. Because those are the people that most tend to gain the scrutiny of the government. And while the government may, in the course of its bureaucracy or in the course of its pigheadedness, begin to do some things that cause the average citizen some discomfort or some unpleasantness or some things that we don't like, by and large, we don't spend our time sitting around thinking, boy, any minute now, they may come knock on my door and arrest me, But there are people who live their lives that way. People who go in and out of prison, people who are in front of the courts regularly, people who know that the life they're leading is constantly at risk of governments and civil secular authorities arresting them or prosecuting them for what they're doing. So when we see what Paul's saying here, one of the things I think we have to recognize it, and while Rome was by far a long way from being perfect, it did have a very clear set of rules that applied to, well, they had two sets of rules, so for citizens and for non-citizens, but rules about evidence and rules about how you could be, what you could be arrested for. The law was clear for the most part. It was not imposed completely capriciously, particularly if you were a citizen. Now, if you weren't a citizen, it wasn't quite as nice, but nevertheless, there were laws and there were rules. And for the most part, the military forces of the empire, what were the military forces of the Roman Empire?
The Roman army. They
were the Roman army, but they had a particular name that we come to associate, the legions. And there's several places in the Bible that mentions the legions, but the thing that's interesting about the legions is the legions served as both military and police. They functioned for the most part as the empire's police, with the exception of in a particular city you might have the local government that would have some kind of local law enforcement type of function as well. But ultimately, when it came down to the authority of the Roman Empire, the legionnaires were the ones who carried that out wherever it was that the Roman Empire extended.
And that was actually true in Jerusalem because the priests had their own police force associated with the temple.
Right.
And those are the guys that probably went to arrest Jesus.
And also arrested Paul later on. And it was, or attempted to arrest Paul, and then it turned into a riot, and then the legions came at that point. And the thing that we're quite certain from history is that the legions terrified people. There were by the time we get to where we're at in history with the first century and that period era, the legions had effectively dominated every military force they'd ever come up against, and they outnumbered everybody. They had tactics and weapons that had become synonymous with who and what they were. And so when things went wrong, if you were on the right side, you wanted to see the legion show up. If you were the bad guys, you were terrified or you were horrified when the legion showed up because they were not there to do you any good. And so, in a broad sense, even when we look at governments that are not very good and not very godly, more often than not, when you have some kind of a stable government, part of the reason it's stable is because it has imposed civil order. Now, sometimes they do it very brutally and very destructively, but nevertheless, even in places where you have a lot of things that we disagree with in terms of what the laws are, by and large, if you have a stable government, the laws are being upheld. So, for example, Iran. In Iran, obviously being a Christian is not exactly an easy exercise, and certainly their perspective on Christianity is very hostile because of their support for Islam. But if you look at Iran in the sense of stepping back from what religion you want to practice and look at the overall situation there, they have a fairly effective law enforcement. They have laws that, most of which, outside of the religious ones, would be, you know, the sort of thing that you would expect in a conservative Western democracy or government as well. They, you know, make it very difficult to be a pickpocket or a thief or a murderer or, you know, those kinds of things. And they criminalize things we wouldn't criminalize in America, although in some cases probably things that as Christians we would kind of like to see criminalized. And so there are things that they are doing at the far end of the spectrum that are very problematic. But in general, if you live in Iran and you follow the law, you really don't have a lot to worry about most of the time. Now there are exceptions to that. You look at Saddam Hussein's Iraq and what he was doing there, where he was just abusing his power wildly. And, you know, and certainly there are times when authority in dictatorial situations can and does do things that do not follow the law and that have no real accountability for it. China can make people disappear, it's become clear. Not even just the average person, which is real easy, but really important people. They've made them disappear simply because they said one wrong sentence in the process of communicating to the public or to Western groups or something like that. And so authority can very much still be abused, but the overall trend within most organized societies, and there is an exception to this, but most organized societies is that the civil or secular authorities are primarily concerned with keeping an orderly society by creating laws that will generally keep people from being out of control. The biggest exception to this, other than things like the Saddam Hussein situation, are anarchy situations like we see in African nations sometimes, where you have a series of warlords that are just fighting each other. There's no real civic authority at that point, there's just conflict. And when we have that kind of a situation, things tend to get pretty lawless. But in general, stable governments don't tend to do that. Sylvia, I saw your hand up for a while now, so.
Well, the legions is also used for demons. Remember Gadara with that man that was possessed in that cemetery, and then Jesus asked, "What's your name?" And they said, "The legion, because for many."
Yes. But in that case, he's using it in a slightly different context than the way that the legions were referring to themselves in the Roman context. They weren't announcing that there were a bunch of demon-possessed guys as they were coming. There were many of them, was the idea. And that, well, perhaps, but the legions, the term relates to the numbers, not to the purpose of them, or good or bad or whatever. So the point that I want to get at here is that what Paul is saying here is a generally true statement, even in governments that do bad things. And there's a really important thing that we need to understand because of our perspective. Our perspective on what governments should be is deeply impacted, and I think rightfully so, by our experience with our form of government. We, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, we live in the most generous, the most free, the most open form of government that's ever existed. We have a government that allows the press to print anything and ask questions that in most nations, even today, would get you killed for asking them. And there are questions sometimes that are just irritating and impertinent, but most of the time they're important. You know, the press holds our government accountable for things that it does and requires them to answer for the things that they do. We have the rights, to protest and assemble and to petition the government for redress, either by petition or by taking them to court. We have a lot of things that we can do that historically have never been available, and even today are still available in what I would consider the minority of nations in a meaningful way. Mostly westernized democracies and a few other things like that. But these rights and this perspective on what government should be, and that it should be something that is, you know, for the people and by the people and of the people, this is a new concept. This is a very young concept. From a governmental standpoint, the U.S. was the first one to ever try it, and that only started 240 years ago, roughly, 235 years ago, something like that. So, what's that?
The first indication of any of this concept that we adopted fully here in the United States was the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta was written way past Paul. 1400s, so they were living in a completely different dynamic then.
And one of the things we have to recognize with, as you said, the Magna Carta came in the, I want to say the 1400s, and it was only applied to a small group of nobles. And the idea that people in general should have these kinds of rights gradually developed over time until America actually tried to put it into practice in a very broad way. But prior to that time, and to the beginning of those kinds of principles, what you had was people who just assumed that the government was going to be kind of tyrannical and it wasn't going to generally benefit them, and that in general they would just assume the government left them alone so they could do their own business. And the only people that were really excited about the form of government they typically had was the people who were in charge of the government because they had the power. But for the most part, people through most of history have been used to the idea that government is not for them, it is simply something that is imposed on them. And so one of the things we have to recognize is that our perspective taints the way that we think about governments and we think about authority, much the same way that our perspective is so very different from the Jews' perspective when it comes to how God is responsible for things. The Jewish perspective, Paul's perspective, would have been that everything that happens is controlled by God. Now, how they understood that, what that meant is a little bit different than what those words mean in English to us. But nevertheless, when the scriptures say that God hardened Pharaoh's hearts, the Jews don't go, well, wow, does that mean free choice was taken away? Because the Jews didn't think about what free choice meant at all. You were guilty of things you did, but that didn't mean you freely chose them necessarily. Guilt and choice were not necessarily aligned the way that they are in our minds because of our political system. So when we think about the world, our view is profoundly warped in a good way to our benefit by having had this experience with democracy and with all the benefits of democracy. When we talk about authority, and Paul is writing about authority, he's writing in a very different context to people who are used to and to people who accept the idea that authority is oftentimes very impersonal, very unchallengeable, and that it does what it's going to do. And yet, the Roman authority and the Greeks before them, by and large, served to keep a stable environment and a relatively safe environment for the people that lived in it. And so when Paul says these things, we look at them from our Western perspective. We say, how can you say that the Roman government is not a cause of fear for good behavior when they persecute Christians? Well, part of it is that Paul wrote this before the persecutions began, but part of it is also because I think that there's an extent to which Paul is accepting that whole issue from what he's talking about here. Because obviously, if you look at the idea of a tyrannical government that does whatever it wants to, there are going to be times when it does things that are opposed to what God would want you to do. But you kind of have to, it's almost like Paul is sort of saying without saying this, you just kind of have to take that in stride, because that's part of what governments are going to do. And that's where you have to choose to do the right thing, even when the government says something different. But overall, the trend, the motion of most stable governments is to enforce laws, to do or to carry out what the good of those laws articulates, and to punish those who do evil. So, like I said, this is a difficult concept for us because of the way that we approach it. But Paul says that it is necessary to be in subjection. Now, again, not in the context of when the government says to do something that God tells us not to do. But in general, if the trend of the government, if the movement of the government is to do good, and we are simply interfering with that for the sake of interfering with it, or doing things that are evil simply for the sake of doing things that are wrong because we're not under man's authority but under God's authority, then we are getting in the way of the righteous and appropriate use of authority. And so I think when we talk about this concept, we have to be careful, number one, to understand that he's talking about and thinking about government and what government does in a very different way than we do. But secondly, I think it's important for us to recognize that even bad governments do a lot of relatively good things for their culture and their society, and that's why, in general, being opposed to the government or doing things that oppose the government just to create problems is not something God wants us to be doing. So we have an obligation to uphold the laws of our society and the rules of our society unless they do directly disagree with what God has told us to do, in which case we have to find another way. But there again, we don't want to rebel against everything just because of one thing. We don't want to make it something like that. So, and then at the end, he talks about an affirmative duty, and this is important too, because he actually says not only do you need to not interfere, but you need to do what you're supposed to do under the expectations of the government. You need to pay taxes. You need to render what is due. So custom to those who are due custom, fear to whom fear is due, honor to whom honor is due. And these concepts are not based out of this guy's a good king, so we're going to honor him because he's the guy that honor is due to. These customs are based out of this guy is the king, and the king is due honor. How do I know that? How do I articulate that from the scriptures? Well, the easiest way to articulate or find that in the scriptures is actually with Saul and David. Because David has been anointed by God to be the next king, and yet he will not overthrow Saul, who was clearly a bad king, an evil man. He won't overthrow Saul because God gave him the authority. And even when he finds out that Saul has been killed on the battlefield, apparently because he wanted to be killed by somebody who was there on the battlefield and claims to have killed him to save him from falling into the hands of the Philistines, David executes that man because he says, you don't have the authority to raise your hand against the Lord's anointed. So David says, I've been anointed by God, I'm still not going to rebel against this guy. This guy's about to die on the battlefield, you still don't raise your hand against him. So clearly, even though sometimes you have rulers who are bad rulers, there is still an honor and a fear that is due them because of who they are, or rather what they are, even if who they are is not particularly impressive. Now, we have a different situation in our society to some extent when it comes to how we respond to the government. Because under our laws, the supreme laws of the land, in fact the Constitution, we do have the right to complain about what our government is doing, to protest about what our government is doing, to attempt to elect alternative officials, or even to run in our own stead for those jobs. We have the opportunities to do those things, and we should do those things where it's appropriate. There's nothing wrong with Christians engaging in lawful protest, engaging in lawful political speech, in saying things and pointing out what's wrong with what the government or particular individuals is doing, as long as it doesn't cross the line into being dishonoring the government. And in fact, to some extent, in the democracy at least, criticizing or pointing out bad decisions or bad behavior on the part of elected officials is actually a function of doing what is good, because you are helping to normalize the democracy away from extremism or away from inappropriate behavior. So we are blessed in a tremendous way to live in a democracy where we have that option. But that doesn't mean if we go to some other country that doesn't have those kinds of principles that we can just do whatever we want to then. Because now we're in a system and in a position where the law says something different. And we have to be mindful of those distinctions as we move from one place to another. All right, before I go on to the last bit of this, any comments on the stuff I've kind of been talking about? Mark?
I was going to say, we've got to remember that we're citizens of God. I mean, we're really just sojourners or whatever here. We're looking forward to a lot better country or
yes.
a place. But we got to remember that God is in it for the long haul. We got this instantaneous life now. We can look on our phones and pretty much do anything.
Yeah.
But God knows and has this plan, and it had it through all this time about winning this and winning it for as many people and getting back his people. So we've got to remember that whatever happens, everybody goes, oh, how could God have this happen? You know, he's way past us.
Right.
And so a lot of times we want this instantaneous why this is happening right now, when his is way past our thoughts and knowing what's going to happen and all those things.
Right.
So sometimes we got to step back as Christians and say, hey, wait a second, we're really part of his family, you know,
yeah.
and let this go, because
yeah.
sometimes that's what needs to happen.
And one of the things that tells us is that even when bad things are happening, even when things happen that God doesn't want to have happen, that are violations of his laws, he still uses those things. They are part of the arrow of history that goes where he wants history to end up. And so when you have, you know, in the Old Testament, I forget the guy's name, who was a servant of the king of, let's say, Aram, or one of the nations around Israel. And one of the prophets went to him and says to him, you're going to become king. And then you're going to do a bunch of really terrible things to the Israelites. Well, the way he became king was by smothering his master and then taking over the throne. He obviously in violation of exactly what we're reading right here. God didn't say, you're going to become king and you're going to do it in all the right ways. He didn't say, you're going to become king and I'm so glad about it. He said, you're going to become king. This is what's going to happen. There's a reason why this is happening, but it doesn't mean that what you're going to do to make it happen is a good thing or an acceptable thing. So it's important for us to recognize that in the context both of when we see and we deal with unrighteous governments, and sometimes also when we see and we deal with people doing things that are violations of a passage like this, but that may ultimately lead to better things in the long run, that doesn't mean that what they did was justified, but it does mean that God has a plan that is moving things forward. And so even when evil is done, God still puts that in and makes that part of the plan that accomplishes his ultimate goals. Did I see another hand? Sylvia?
And then it's also, when you said, you know, with Pharaoh, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Not actually, but he gave him over to his wishes, like in the New Testament too. He gives you, on a certain point, he just gives you over to your own wishes, mind, whatever. And that happens in the Old too, you know. That
Yeah, so we see this process, and the reality is that God set sort of laws and rules in place that govern how the world works. And when we do things, there are consequences, there are outcomes, and not just for us, but for people around us, and when somebody who has massive amounts of power and a huge military does things that are bad, the consequences get magnified on a level that we, individually are rarely able to accomplish things. So there is this reality of choice, and free will necessitates that bad consequence in some cases, happen not just to the person who makes the choice, but also in many cases to the people around them. That is the nature of sin, and we see that from the beginning, because the curse on Adam for what he did falls on the entire earth. And the earth, where a sentient being might protest, I didn't do anything wrong, why am I being punished? And yet that very much happened. So I saw, was it Jerry?
I was just thinking, maybe it's a dumb question, but does God care if I go over the speed limit?
No.
I'll just stick with Steve's answer. The thing is, we're taught to obey the civil authorities. That's what he says here. So strictly speaking, I suppose that yes, but this is the God who also knows how many hairs you've got on the top of your head. So he can keep track of even the little stuff. I don't know that. I'm not going to get into that. Because frankly, I have a much bigger question for you guys to deal with at the end to finish this out. So here's the big issue. Okay, so we're looking through this. We're talking about authority. We're talking about honoring authority. So does anybody see any concerning aspects about that when it comes to how our country came into existence?
That's always concerned.
See, because when you look at the Declaration of Independence, it says, the preamble at the beginning, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Self-evident truths. By the way, that's them saying we don't actually have a basis in philosophy or law for this. We're just going to say it's obvious to everybody. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, and this is where it starts to get really problematic, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So when we read the Declaration of Independence, the underlying principle on which this country was founded would appear to be a principle that disagrees with what Paul says in Romans. Because in Romans, Paul says you honor authority because it's from God. You don't rebel against it. You don't dishonor it. You don't try to, overthrow it. You do what God wants you to do where it disagrees with that authority. He doesn't say that, and we see that practiced by him and others, and so we know that's true. But you don't go around altering and abolishing the forms of governments, which is exactly what the founders of the country and the writers of both the Declaration of Independence and later on the Constitution decided that we should do. What's interesting is that basically the justification that they gave for it was that these are self-evident truths. It's obviously true that people are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, created equal. I would agree with that men are created equal because men are men, but the inalienable rights thing, that's a problematic one by itself, because a lot of those rights we don't actually, the pursuit of happiness in particular, we don't see that in the scriptures a lot. I mean, God goes to Moses and says, go to Pharaoh and get your people out. That's not the pursuit of happiness. That's like the opposite of the pursuit of happiness right there, He says to, other people, whether it's Paul, when he calls him, I'm going to show you how much you have to suffer for my name. That's not the pursuit of happiness. It's the pursuit of God's will, So there's underlying presumptions that are problematic. And then when they go on forward, they said the reason why governments are instituted is because they're going to secure the rights of people. It doesn't exactly sound like Paul's argument, does it? Now, Paul says governments do what is right and you don't have to be afraid of them, but he doesn't say the reason that they've got power is to protect the rights of everybody else. The reason they've got power is God gave them power. So we're in this kind of weird place. So I'm going to do Sylvia because she raised her hand first, and then I'll get Steve.
But if you go with the signers and all that, and you say it goes actually against what Paul says or God says, but 40 of the signers were Freemasons and not Christians. I think America became a Christian nation because of the preaching of the gospel.
Okay. Well, those Freemasons would have considered themselves Christians. They were members in many cases of Christian denominations.
They were also members of, I don't know what secret things.
Yeah, I don't know that we want to get too deeply into conspiracy theories here, because ultimately it doesn't really matter whether they were Christians or not. The question is the legitimacy of the argument that they're making. Steve, go ahead.
Well, I think Paul's statement you can misunderstand. So I don't think he is, as you described, saying that as Christians we should not ever rebel against a government or do things that would not honor that existing government, etc., what he mentioned. So my take on it is that Paul is trying to say something that's more of a general statement, because he qualifies it by saying the governments are there because God wants government for mankind. Not that he specifically appoints evil people into the governments to create an evil government. So there are evils in the government, and those are the people that are running things. So I think it's okay, personally, to interpret the Constitution there as saying we're no longer going to be subject to the evils of Great Britain and its tyranny, and it's time for us now to form a new government. So that, I don't think that's a violation of what Paul is saying. I think he's just generally saying, hey, as a Christian, we have to live in a world where these things are out there. So let's try and get along with it. Let's try and do what's due. But if the government is evil, when it's supposed to be the one that's going after evil, then that's not what Paul's talking about.
Okay. Ian.
Okay. So what makes the British Empire a legitimate government? What did they, outside of England, what did they not overthrow an existing government already?
Well, technically it wasn't their government, so they didn't have authority over them, I guess.
Okay, so Nazi Germany.
Yes.
Should we have let that ride?
Well, you're getting ahead of me here. So, so one of the things we have to recognize is that there's a difference. There's a definite difference between when God sets up authority against authority, because that's what He did with the Israelites invading Canaan and laying waste to Canaan. Their job was to get rid of all these godless people. So authority versus authority is a very different thing than authority over those under authority and then them rebelling against authority. That's a different concept. Now, that doesn't mean that Steve's point is wrong, it's just that those are two different things. Where we get into Nazi Germany, from my perspective, is the question of, so what about people living in Nazi Germany who can see that they're living under an evil government? Does that mean they just have to hey, we'll just do whatever you tell us to as long as it doesn't violate our conscience, and we're not going to do anything to stop you? You know, that's another question. Like I said, I want to get there in a second. But to Steve's point, one of the things that's interesting is, I'm going to actually go through and look at what the articulated reasons for the Founding Fathers leaving under the Declaration of Independence are, because they actually went through and articulated those reasons. So let's go through them real quick here and take a look. It says, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Now, before we get to this, let's remember that everybody who's writing this thing, for the most part, people who came from England as part of that conquering process of overthrowing the existing people who had their own lands and properties here in this country. So there's a certain element of hypocrisy right off the bat if they're going to try to say, hey, all those bad things he did by invading America, that's really terrible, and he shouldn't have done that, and that's why we should get rid of him. Because, you know, who were part of that. But anyway, he says, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. In other words, he wouldn't agree to some of the laws that the colonists wanted to pass that they needed his permission to pass. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he is utterly neglected to attend to them. In other words, again, he's not passing laws that we want him to pass quickly enough, and he won't let other people pass them without him approving them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the rights of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. What does he mean by that? Well, what he's talking about there is that he is not passing, specifically, there are several regions of the country by the time that they wrote this that were already in rebellion, or that had already begun to do things that were lawless from the perspective of the crown, such as, I don't know, jumping onto British ships dressed like Native Americans and tossing tea overboard. And so when they did those things, what's that?
Who wrote that?
Who wrote this?
Yeah. Thomas Paine?
Jefferson, along with several other men. Jefferson is considered to be the key author.
Okay, so it's not one person, it was a group or a committee?
Yeah, well, it was Jefferson that did most of the writing at the request of the Continental Congress, and then the members of the Congress signed off on it. So Jefferson was the one who was responsible for most of the language, but ultimately the members of the Continental Congress signed off on it. So most of whom would ultimately also go on to be signatories of the Constitution. So not all, but in fact Jefferson, ironically, was not one of those. But so what he's talking about here is a situation where a number of regions of the colonies, the king had first of all, the kings had altered the borders of some of the colonies. Then they had gone back and put them back the way they were. Then they, as they were having increasing troubles maintaining control and order in the colonies, they began to pass laws or refuse to pass laws that the people wanted because they were in rebellion and the king wouldn't allow them to pass. Now what's kind of interesting here is that most of the things that they're saying, actually the king was not directly responsible for. Anybody know who was directly responsible for it in England?
Parliament?
Parliament, yeah. Most of their problems are with Parliament. What happened initially, in fact, the first Continental Congress was called after the Boston, it was before the Boston Tea Party, after the Boston Massacre. The first Continental Congress was called, and their initial attempt was to approach the king to get him to undo some of the stuff that Parliament was doing, because Parliament was the one that was passing most of this. The king still had much more power then than he does today, where today he's just a figurehead, or he today is just a figurehead. But by and large, almost all legislation originated with Parliament. And so what's interesting here is that they made a conscious decision, and Jefferson in particular made a conscious decision to write all of this as a challenge against the king, because why? Why would he write it about the king instead of about the Parliament?
Because it's just one person now, he can be called a tyrant.
Right. It's pretty hard to call a Parliament a tyrant because it's an elected assembly of the British people. It doesn't look very tyrannical, except for the fact that the colonists don't get to vote in the Parliament. But no colonists anywhere in the British Empire got to vote. The biggest difference is that there was something different about the colonists in America versus everywhere else, which is what?
They were English.
They were mostly English. The colonies were unusual because, unlike all of Britain's other colonies, which were they'd gone in and they were there to basically extract natural resources and to take advantage of the labor forces that existed there, in America, most of the colonies, the colonists that were of importance anyway, were English, or they were from Europe, and so they had a background in the kinds of democracy that Parliament represented. So they're saying he won't pass the laws that we want him to pass, even for lots of people. But the king's response, really Parliament's response, is we won't pass those laws because you won't stop rebelling against us. You're a constant thorn and you're creating all these problems for us. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant. Oh, how terrible. He's called them together at places that are unusual, and we didn't really want to go there, and it's a long way away from where we are, from the depository of their public records, so we don't, not that it's hard to get there, it's just that the records are a long way away, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. And I had to leave a bit off of this because it wasn't going to fit on the slide. What they're saying basically is that he dissolved, and he did, the Parliament did do this, and the King's authority was technically underlied this, that on several occasions, particularly in Massachusetts, when they did the Boston Tea Party and they were basically on the verge of open rebellion, he suspended the Legislative Assembly of Massachusetts, completely shut it down, and he was moving to do that in several other places as well. Not that Parliament didn't still have control of the situation, but the king and Parliament were dissolving those representative bodies because they were no longer acting in the interests of Great Britain, and that's what they perceived the concern to be. So then he won't let other ones get elected, and then he says what they're arguing, or what Jefferson argues, is basically what's happened then is that these legislative powers have devolved back to the people from which they came, because remember that's sort of the basis of this whole concept, is that rights and powers come from the people. That they've gone back to the people, and now the people are just using it wild and they're out of control. Which kind of sounds more like a you problem than a me problem, you know, if I'm the king reading this. But so to this one. So then we go on. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. So in other words, he's trying to keep more people from coming here from other places. And he's trying to make it hard for them when they get here to actually become part of the citizenry, and he's trying to make it hard for us to take over other people's territory. And when I say other people's territory, I'm serious, because the biggest thing that they were really objecting to on this particular one is that the king basically said, okay, the Appalachian Mountains, you don't go past them. We control territory beyond that. We got it from the French at the end of the French and Indian War. All the Indians live over there, and every time you go over there, they start a war with us, and we have to send the British Army over to defend you. We're tired of that. You don't go over the Appalachians. And the American, or the British settlers said, we want to go over the Appalachians. There's really good farmland over there. We're going to keep going. And so what they're literally saying is he won't get more land for us to go move into, taking it from other people. But you know, let's not talk about that part. It's just it's just land. You know, there's no people there, no problem. So essentially, and then this is what also is funny too, because he won't let people who are different come into the states. And one of the first things that the Congress did after they got control of it is they accepted for certain people from being able to come into the country. So it's very there's a lot of kind of let's kind of ignore some of the important facts here as they write these things. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. Here again, it's the same thing as the basis for when they shut down the legislative assemblies in the colonies. They basically started putting in British judges because the American judges were just ignoring the law and not actually holding the colonists accountable for smuggling and various things like that. He's made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. And all that was true because the king said, hey, it's my justice system. I get to send my judges over and I get to pay them because your judges won't actually do the law. They won't actually follow the law. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and to eat out their substance. Man, talk about a modern day problem that we have. It's just a multitude of new offices. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislators. That's my favorite one. The colonies had begged the British government to send them standing armies to prevent them from getting into wars with the Native Americans, especially when they would try to steal the Native Americans' land. And now they're mad because he's bothered to send armies over and leave them there. And they didn't get the consent of their legislatures, even though the legislatures were the ones that asked them to do this. So yeah, he has sent a lot of new customs officials and things like that because the British government actually was losing all sorts of money because the colonists were really good at smuggling. And so they had all these taxes and the colonists just avoided them by smuggling things in. So the British came up with this idea, and instead of raising the customs duties, they said, okay, we're going to lower customs everywhere. We're going to lower the taxes everywhere. But we're going to send a whole bunch of actual customs enforcement officers to make sure you actually pay those lower customs, which for most American shipments meant that they were going to pay taxes for the first time, and they really didn't like that. So what they're objecting to is the idea that somebody might actually enforce the law, basically. It would be the equivalent of saying, we've got a whole bunch of new police officers, and I can't stand that. That just seems so unfair that we've got all these new police officers here in town to keep law and order. It's expected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. Well, the superior part, we want the military, well, in his case, the military was still under the control of the king and parliament. It wasn't under their control, and that's what they didn't like. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. What they're literally saying there is that the king has forced them to follow the laws of parliament. The parliament that they all as British citizens are actually benefiting from having a legislative body over them. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, the king decided that if the colonists were going to keep getting into trouble with the Native Americans, they were going to have to pay for keeping the armies there to protect them. And so they had to either give them someplace to live or pay for them to live someplace rather than having the king do it. for protecting them by a mock trial for punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these lands. That's actually a fair one. The king got so fed up, or the parliament got so fed up with what the colonists were doing, that they created a law that basically said you can, if you're a British official and you're charged with a crime in the Americas, you get to go back to Britain to be tried for those things, where you probably aren't going to actually face justice. Now, by the time this was written, that had been repealed, but that was the law for a while. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, that was also true under the mercantile system. They had to trade through Britain if they wanted to trade, which made Britain a lot of money. For imposing taxes on us without our consent, again, Parliament was doing it, and so they thought if we don't get the vote in Parliament, it's not fair. For depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, again, that was somewhat true. And for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, that was where sometimes they would get transported back to Britain to be tried for stuff. So they got a whole bunch of different stuff, and this one, abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing there an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into the colonies. Who are they talking about there? A nearby province. Canada. Basically, they're saying they've done things in Canada we don't like either. I love that. It's not fair. So, and enlarging its boundaries. Well, temporarily, actually, they did enlarge the boundaries of Canada to try to punish the colonists for some of the things that they were doing in rebellion. So, for taking away our charters, abolishing our laws, altering fundamentally the forms of our government, for our suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us, because by this time it's important to realize that the Revolutionary War had been underway for more than a year by the time this is written. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Yeah, you're at war with him. What did you think was going to happen? You know, you literally took a bunch of guys and went and shot a bunch of British soldiers as they were marching to try to take some guns away from you. You're at war. Of course he did those things. So the problem when you look at these things through history is that most of the justifications and arguments that they're making are against a government that for them was one of the best governments that anybody had ever lived in historically up to that point. Now we live in a much better one now, but the reality is that almost every complaint that they're making is against the government that if you had taken Paul out of there and said, here's the place you're going to have to live, here's how things are going to be, isn't that terrible? Shouldn't we rebel? Paul would be like, what are you, nuts? This is way better than anything we could ever imagine, you know? And so it's fascinating because the colonists are rebelling against a government that is one of the most democratic governments that had ever existed at the time. And the king, who is the target of their issue, is not really the source of most of the problems that they're having. So the point that I want to make out of this is not to try to get into an argument about whether revolt is appropriate sometimes or not, because Germany stands as an example that's far better than our country ever did, and what we did with Great Britain ever did, of what to do or what needs to be done sometimes in a situation where a government is utterly evil. And the need for people to stand up and to do things that violate the laws in various ways, and perhaps even to try to overthrow the government in those situations. But in a situation like ours, the problem is that when you overthrow government simply because you want to do it your way, you create a mindset, a concept, that is not, I think, what Paul had in mind when he wrote Romans. And I think that starts to become a problem when you think about the direction our society has gradually taken. If you build a society on the principle that government can be overthrown when it doesn't do what you want, it's really hard to get people to honor authority going forward. And it may work for a while because you've got a lot of really good people, but over time that lawless trend is going to magnify and get worse, because all bad trends tend to magnify and get worse over history unless there's a lot of effort put into stamping them down. And so when we decided to build our nation around the idea that overthrowing government authority was okay, we sort of undermined the legitimacy of authority within our country in a way that I don't think we ever really anticipated. The Founding Fathers certainly didn't really anticipate. But today, we are reaping the fruits of that kind of thinking with people who don't honor the government in any way, who don't buy into authority in any meaningful way because they're used to seeing it from the standpoint of you can throw it over if it's not what you want. And I think that is something that should trouble us, not from the standpoint of, oh, we did it wrong and our country's all flawed and everything, because that's not my point. I keep saying we live in the best democracy, the best country in the world. What I'm saying is that there are consequences when you do things in a way different than God wants you to do them. And God uses us and uses good and bad things to accomplish His purposes, but sometimes those consequences of making the wrong choice can come back and hurt you down the road once you've accomplished God's purpose, or even as a part of God's purpose. And so this is a nuanced and complex thing, but it is a reality that we have to be careful about how we handle and deal with authority, because ultimately authority represents God, even if they don't always do it very well. All right, we got to stop.